Hello, everybody, and welcome to Insurance Runs, brought to you by our good friends at State Farm, right here at opensports.com. I'm your host, Sid Rosenberg, and today, a very special show. One of my favorite writers. This guy is great. Jeff Pearlman, author, columnist, blogger, the next king of all media. There's nothing this man doesn't do. He's written some great books along the way. It's my friend, Jeff Pearlman. Good afternoon, Jeff. How are you, buddy?
I'm very, very good. Happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Now, back in sports writing again here, Jeff, after taking a hiatus a few years back, obviously in your blood, is it something you got from your stepfather? A little Roger Clemens joke there. You like that?
Yeah, very good.
And being that you did, I know you wrote the book with Roger Clemens, which was great. I read your Barry Bonds book, which I thought was great. The '86 Mets book, the Dallas Cowboy book of the 1990s. On my radio show a couple times about that. The infamous John Rocker column at Sports Illustrated. So, of all those people, Jeff, you've had a chance to cover along the way. Some of those not very good people. Here comes a big question for you: who was the biggest douchebag of them all?
I would say Bonds. I think
really?
Bonds. Yeah, Bonds had a. They say like even a blind squirrel finds a nut. So every once in a while, Rocker can be nice to someone, and Clemens had his good and bad. But Bonds, I interviewed probably 500 people for that book, and it was a struggle to find 20 who had anything good to say about him. Just universally mean across the board.
But when I read your book, and I thought, you did a great job with the Bonds book. What I learned in the book was that between Willie Mays being in his life, Jeff, and his dad being in his life, and when his dad was a young baseball player, Willie told his father to kind of stay away from the media. They're out to get you. So from reading your book, Jeff, I got the impression that it was engraved, it was taught to Barry Bonds early on. People are out to get him, the media, the fans. Watch out for these people.
Yeah, definitely true. And I mean, you have to remember when Willie Mays and Bobby Bonds were coming along, there was a lot of sort of mistrust between the mainly white media and the African-American players. And there was also a lot of mistrust between mainly almost exclusively white ownership and white management and white coaching staff and the African-American players. And I think they were the players were kind of justified to a certain degree to mistrust sort of the man at the time. By the time Bonds came along, Barry came along, a lot of times it sort of changed in many ways, but he still had that sort of mistrust, and he looked at the media with a lot of skepticism and sort of looked at his bosses and the fans and pretty much everybody with skepticism too.
Now, out of the three gentlemen we just talked about here, Bonds, Clemens, and Rocker, your newest book covers Roger Clemens. Of course, he's in the news now, has been for about the last year, and he has really fallen from grace here, Jeff. Reading a book again, you kind of got that feeling that was going to happen here early on. Your thoughts on Roger Clemens, and do you think that he's being treated properly throughout the media?
Well, I do. I think he stood before Congress and he lied, which was, a pretty bad mistake and certainly opens yourself up. The one thing that I like, actually, that makes me feel sort of satisfied here is when everything was going on with Bonds, and when I wrote my book and when Game of Shadows came out, there was a lot of talk of, the sort of the racial element and why is Bonds getting it so badly and other players are going completely, under the radar. So I think when Clemens came along and got it just as bad as Bonds did, it at least showed that, we're trying to be sort of, if nothing else, we're trying to be fair here. And this is an issue of guys who cheated and guys who took advantage of the rules of the game. So when I see Clemens sort of, there are 2 books out on him by now. He hasn't gotten a job in baseball. No one's touching him. No one's talking about him. I feel like at least people are being fair, and he deserved this as much as Bonds did.
Now, I don't know if you know this or not, Jeff, but you are part of the blog world even today on Deadspin, a story talking about Clemens, Bonds, and John Rocker going back to when you wrote the book about John Rocker. I guess you aggravated one former San Francisco Giant great, Will Clark, and had a run-in with Will Clark years ago back in 2000 and again in 2007. And I read some of the excerpts from the run-ins, I should say, and they're both pretty brutal on Clark's part. So would you say that Will Clark is a worse guy than Barry Bonds?
No, Bonds is the worst, but Clark is just terrible. I mean, Clark is he's one of my least favorite guys I ever covered, and it actually starts funny. Actually, it started the first time I covered Will Clark. I was a very young reporter at SI, and the magazine sent me to Texas to write about the Rangers, and all the press was gathered around Will Clark, and I'm like this 24 years old or 25, and sort of nervous and new, and everyone's gathered around Will Clark because he's coming back from a broken foot, and in the middle of the interview, in the middle of people asking questions, I just say, does your foot hurt? And Clark looks at me, stares down at my badge, and goes, Jeff, I broke my effing foot. Just like the intent clearly to humiliate. And I laughed it off. But then a few years later, after Rocker, I mean, he really let me have it in front of the entire locker room. And then a few years later, when I was reporting on Bonds, I sort of tried to make amends with him a little, and he was as big a jerk as ever. I mean, just brutal. And luckily, he was a coach at that point, like a spring assistant. I didn't really need him. So I was finally able to kind of fire back at him, and we had a pretty good exchange. But
I read that. You actually did get back at him pretty good. See, I could see him to a certain extent defending Barry Bonds. They were teammates, obviously, in San Francisco, played a World Series together for the Giants. But why would Will Clark be banging down your doors defending John Rocker?
Well, I think he thought, and other guys felt this way too. So it's not just him. I think he felt that I was unfair to him, and I kind of, whatever, you took advantage of him, and blah 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 blah. And that's just Clark was always a guy who always, he wanted to make you feel small or make himself feel big. I'm not sure which, but always kind of brutal to cover.
Oh, well, Darryl Strawberry had a book come out just a couple of months ago, maybe even just last month, Jeff, about his experience with the New York Mets at 86 team. And, of course, one of your bestsellers, I should say, is your book about the 86 Mets. And I know for a fact that Ronnie Darling, who does a terrific job, by the way, on the SNY Met broadcast alongside Gary Cohen and Keith Hernandez, loved your book and told you pretty much hit that thing on the head. I know you had a blast covering the Dallas Cowboy era as well, but covering the 86 Mets, the book on the 86 Mets, was that about as good as it got for you, Jeff?
Yeah, it really was, actually. I mean, it's one thing, so you're writing about Bonds, and he's a guy you covered, or Clemens and a guy you covered, but, I was, 1986, I was 14 years old living in New York, and it was joy for me, and those guys were like, they were gods to me. So to write about them, even to delve into the negative and to see this sort of underworld of, Gooden and Strawberry and Hernandez and the different guys, it was still fun because there was like a chance to relive my childhood. And, people said, when Strawberry wrote his book, I was asked, are you bothered that he wrote a book, or, are you worried about it? I'm thrilled. I hope the book sells 1 million copies. I mean, I think he's a good guy. I think he's trying to make right in his life. And, I'll read it at some point. I mean, the more there is to read about the 86 Mets, the better, as far as I'm concerned, because they were one of the most joyful, enjoyable teams we've ever had.
I agree with you. I was 19 years old living in Brooklyn, New York when the Mets won that thing. And to this day, even with the likes of Tom Seaver and Mookie Wilson and Mike Piazza, Darryl Strawberry remains my favorite Met of all time. Let me ask you this. Seems to be this thing going on in Major League Baseball right now, Jeff, the social anxiety disorder and stress. Just a couple days ago, Joey Votto of the Cincinnati Reds, he called the quits for a couple of weeks. Dontrelle Willis in Detroit, Zach Greinke, who's having a monster year in Kansas City, and now Khalil Green in St. Louis has come up with the same thing here. Well, what is going on here? Maybe this could be your next book, The Pressures of Playing Major League Baseball. These guys can't handle it.
Well, you know what I think it is, to be honest with you? I think baseball and professional sports are sort of the last bastion where men have to be men, and you have to be tough, and you can't show any vulnerability. And I think finally, guys that we're getting past that a little bit. And I don't think it has much to do with baseball so much as I think these guys have issues in their personal lives that they have to deal with. And in the past, you could never admit it. You'd never see a ball player cry. You'd never see a ball player admit he was going through stress or he was going through a tough situation or something wrong was going on at home. So I actually think it's probably a good sign that we're kind of done with this machismo garbage that we used to experience, and that these guys are human beings who go. I mean, the Greinke story in Sports Illustrated by Joe Posnanski, I thought it was actually really important because it shows people that this guy, he's a stud for the Kansas City Royals, but he's just some guy who has the same issues and problems and flaws that we all do.
All right, so on the way out here, about 30 seconds to go, Jeff. Again, you have been a very successful author. I know you got a new project in the works. You can't talk about it right now, but you've had a bunch of really, really good books. I am right now writing my first book titled You're Wrong and You're Ugly with your friend and mine, Paul Schwartz of the New York Post. It is due out next March. Any advice here about how to go about writing this thing, about how to promote this thing? How does Sid Rosenberg get in the Jeff Pearlman realm when it comes to being an author?
I don't know if you want to be in the Jeff Pearlman realm, but my main thing is, to be honest, you have to whore yourself like you've never whored yourself before, which means every blog, every website, every Facebook page that mentions Sid Rosenberg, every radio interview, every TV interview, anybody who wants to talk to you about it, I'll be happy to talk to you about it, and to use the internet to your incredible advantage, and get an excerpt. I'm actually being serious about this, Sid. Get an excerpt, either Fox Sports or Yahoo or SI.com. Find some website that'll excerpt your book because it'll always link at the end straight to your Amazon page, and that's a huge hit.
There you go. And maybe I'll even start with jeffpearlman.com, by the way. I was on there this morning.
Me and my 400 readers will be happy to take you on.
jeffpearlman.com and, of course, SI.com and all the books we talked about along the way. Really a great writer and a good friend. And, Jeff, I can't thank you enough for stopping by today. So best of luck, buddy. We'll talk again in the near future. Thank you so much.
All right. My pleasure. Take care.
Take care. There he is, Jeff Pearlman. That's going to do it for this edition of Insurance Runs, brought to you by our good friends at State Farm, right here on opensports.com. I'm Sid Rosenberg. Be sure to come back on Wednesday for Fantasy Whiplash with Tim Haney from KFFL.com. Until then, I'm Sid Rosenberg. We'll see you then. The future of sports on the web is open.